Hello and welcome to our webinar today, sponsored by Bioinformatics and IMV, part of the Science and Medicine Group. My name is Matt Clusis. Today we'll be speaking to you about disruptions in the clinical lab industry. We've got some very interesting materials to cover, so let's go ahead and dive in. We conducted a survey of 107 clinical laboratory professionals, asking them about a variety of disruptions affecting clinical labs today. The two that they highlighted the most were molecular and genetic tests being conducted in centralized labs and the impact of Medicare Part B cuts as the most important disruptions facing clinical labs today. You can see some other disruptions on this slide. We'll talk about these throughout the presentation. We'll also cover some more in-depth questions that we asked our panel about in a survey. Let's take a step back and focus on the clinical laboratory market as a whole. In 2017, there were 8.76 billion laboratory tests conducted. You can see in terms of volume, almost half of those tests occur in a hospital lab setting. Independent labs, including large behemoths like LabCorp and Quest, combined with other independent labs, constitute over 30% of the market, with another 24% coming from other sources. In terms of laboratory industry revenue, you can see in 2017, the lab industry was $97 billion, growing at a modest, mature market growth rate of about 3%. However, if we look within those numbers, we can definitely see some variations in growth rate. So drug testing and molecular and genetic testing are growing in the low double digits, while anatomic pathology and Pap and HPV testing are modestly declining over the last several years. Looking at all of our disruptions, we'll use the SCP framework, which stands for Structure, Conduct, Performance. It also takes into account external shocks. So starting with structure, let's talk about substitutes. New point-of-care testing technologies continue to be developed, replacing what had been testing conducted in centralized laboratories. We'll talk about some of the trends in that area. New molecular and genomic technologies are becoming ever more complex, requiring more infrastructure, very skilled labor to conduct those technologies, and a real disruption in this space. Consolidation continues to occur in the laboratory space. We'll talk about individual lab consolidation, as well as the impact of mega mergers in the healthcare space and the potential impact that will have for clinical laboratories moving forward. And finally, in terms of performance, Medicare Part B cuts are coming into effect here in 2018 and will continue through 2022. The 2018 impact alone is estimated to be $670 million. And that impact will increase in aggregate over the next several years. So we'll talk about that. Finally, in terms of external shocks, we'll talk about changes to FDA approvals for new clinical laboratory tests, as well as the impact of CMS coverage decisions, for example, covering next generation DNA and RNA sequencing. We asked our panel of 107 clinical laboratory leaders, of these disruptions, which to you are the most important for the clinical lab industry today? As you can see from the slide, new molecular and genetic tests in centralized labs were number one, Medicare Part B cuts were number two, and we go on down the list through there. Again, we'll talk about all of these through the course of today's presentation. So let's talk about genetic and molecular technologies first. These technologies go back at least 15, maybe even 20 years in some cases. Historically, they had focused on very discrete questions. So for example, Genomic Health with their Oncotype DX test focused on the question around chemotherapy in an adjuvant breast cancer setting. Myriad Genetics with their BRCA1 and BRCA2 testing also focused on a fairly discrete question also in cancer. As we move into the next several years, we're seeing new centralized laboratories addressing much larger questions. So for example, in the cancer space, you have companies like Foundation Medicine, OmniSeq, even Adaptive Biotechnologies that are starting to focus on targeted therapy and immunotherapy for cancer treatment. You have other companies like Guardant Health, which are focusing primarily on liquid biopsy methodologies for detecting cancer. You've also got companies focusing on other areas. So, for example, Exact Sciences and Veracyte are focusing beyond cancer on discrete diagnostic questions. A lot of times these companies are starting to build proprietary databases, which tend to manifest in a unique reference population, which an individual patient is measured against. For the individual clinical lab, this becomes a barrier to entry where, because they don't have access to that large reference population, they're not able to offer the same kind of assay, even if the technology itself for the assay is not proprietary. That element of comparison to a reference population can be an enticing factor for a lot of providers. They're also developing additional barriers to entry in terms of the complexity of this testing, the amount of infrastructure required to do it at scale, and the amount of IT resources that go into the interpretation of the results and the generation of a clinical report. This is a particular case study looking at immunotherapy biomarkers from OmniSeq. Now, in immunotherapy, the first therapeutics that were approved relied on PD-L1 IHC staining, which is a technology that's available in most clinical laboratories. However, as providers are looking for the ability to better predict responders versus non-responders, additional biomarkers have been identified. So, for example, tumor mutational burden is another marker for informing immunotherapy treatment decision support. The FDA approved microsatellite instability as a pan-cancer biomarker for select immunotherapy agents. And we're also seeing others, for example, RNA-seq gene expression markers for individual immunotherapy targets come into play. As we look at some of these new markers, they really extend beyond, in many cases, the capabilities of traditional clinical laboratories, necessitating the use of these send-out, centralized third-party labs. We asked our panel, does your lab currently send out samples to any specialty lab? As you can see, less than 50% of respondents said that they do, which means that there are probably labs out there that are still essentially untapped for these centralized labs to consider. Of that 49, we said, do you expect that volume over the next 2 years to increase, decrease, or stay the same? On the right-hand side of this slide, you can see 24 out of the 49, so roughly 50%, said that they expect their send-out volume going to places like Foundation Medicine, Genomic Health, Myriad, and others to increase over the next 2 years. So probably a lot of opportunity for growth in these centralized laboratories that are doing increasingly complex testing. Medicare Part B was the second most important disruption that our panel identified. The impact you can see in a particular example here on the left, where this particular lipid panel was priced at $18.37 in 2017. That decreased to $16.53 for 2018. You can see the further declines over the next 2 years. In aggregate, it's going to be a reduction in the reimbursement for this particular panel of 27% over the next several years. And again, the estimated impact in 2018 alone from Medicare Part B cuts is estimated to be $670 million. So what are labs doing to respond to this? Well, they're looking at a variety of different measurements, and we'll take a closer look at this in the next slide, but things like looking at their managed care contracts to look at reimbursement rates for individual tests, exploring new technologies, renegotiating supply agreements. So these changes are not only going to affect laboratory professionals themselves, they're also going to reach across suppliers and throughout the entire value chain of clinical labs. One of the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, when it comes to these Medicare Part B cuts will be a particular type of laboratory, and that is nursing homes. Nursing homes tend to get quite a bit of their volume from Medicare Part B tests. That's can range anywhere from 40 to 80% of the total revenue for some of these labs. And the profit margins at nursing home labs are razor thin already, somewhere in the range of 2 to 4%. So going back to the last slide, looking at the type of cuts that Medicare Part B has in store for the next several years, that could easily take a lot of these labs into the red, into financial loss, and possibly result in a closure. One leader in the industry, David Nichols, said that CMS could create a real hole where labs such as nursing home labs and others simply can't operate. Even for some of the larger labs like Quest and LabCorp, Quest estimates that in 2018 they'll see a 4% reduction in revenue as a result of these cuts, growing to 10% reductions in 2019 and 2020. So these are real impacts to clinical labs, which are going to have far-reaching impacts not only for small labs, but also for some of the largest independent labs in the United States. We asked our panel, how has your lab's revenue changed in 2018? You can see for most labs, they're saying it's decreased in the single digits, so somewhere between 2 to 9%. And again, going back to our case of the lipid panel from before, that aligns roughly with the economics from that. As we asked our panel, what are you planning to do as a result of these cuts? We discussed a couple of these before. 64% of respondents are looking at new technologies that will help them reduce costs so that they can try to maintain some of the profitability they've had on these tests. Next is looking at supply agreements for instruments and reagents, so we can expect those negotiations to get a bit harder. Renegotiating payer contracts is kind of next on the list. You can see here only 15% of the panel that we surveyed said they plan no changes to their lab operations as a result of these Medicare Part B cuts. Let's transition now to point-of-care testing. So point-of-care testing has existed for some time. There continues to be new innovation in this space, yet the penetration of point-of-care testing is still relatively nascent in the clinical lab space. The value proposition is pretty straightforward. On the left-hand side, you can see the workflow of a point-of-care test relative to a central lab test. Just doing the eye test, you can see there's a lot of additional steps for central lab processing than there would be for point-of-care. But on the right-hand side, point-of-care is not all benefit. So while you do get some savings in terms of time, in terms of labor, in terms of potentially even capital, there are costs. So for example, accuracy tends to be lower with point-of-care testing as opposed to centralized labs. You're going to have higher reagent costs typically for point-of-care tests as they're building in some of the value of the savings into those costs. You're also going to have the need for repeat testing with point-of-care analyzers. So that's another consideration for this type of testing. There's a lot of investment taking place in this area. One of the biggest sponsors of developments in point-of-care testing is the U.S. Department of Defense. DARPA in particular is sponsoring the development of new platforms that can be used potentially in a military theater type application, but as you can imagine, that eventually could flow easily into the clinical lab space. So some of the companies that you see here on the left are focusing on ways to stabilize blood, deliver antibodies in a more discrete manner, rapid identification of antibodies or maybe infectious disease agents, and also again focusing on simplifying the blood sampling and blood collection mechanisms that are used in diagnostic testing. We asked our panel what proportion of your location's total testing volume is performed with point-of-care instruments, and you can see quite a distribution on the left-hand side here. The median comes in at about 10%, although we had some respondents saying they do all of their testing with point-of-care. So there's quite a bit of variation, but it tends to still be on the lower end of the spectrum. We then said over the next 24 months, how do you expect this volume to change? And you can see that most respondents said that they expect either no change or a small increase, somewhere between 2 to 9%. Only 9 out of our 41 respondents to this question said that they expect that increase over the next 2 years to be in excess of 10%. So you can see it's forecasted to grow modestly, but we're not going to be seeing a wholesale swing to point-of-care testing in the next few years. Let's transition now to consolidations. So there's been a lot of industry consolidation in the clinical lab space over the last several years. You can see in 2017 alone, there were 29 laboratory deals, a total of $2 billion, actually greater than $2 billion in transaction value in 2017. And 55% of all of these acquisitions involved only 3 acquirers. So that would be Aurora Diagnostics, Quest, and LabCorp. You can see some sample transactions on the right-hand side. The largest acquisition in 2017 was Konica Minolta's acquisition of Ambry Genetics for up to $800 million. After that, LabCorp's acquisition of Palm came in, and then Quest and Shield Medical Laboratory after that. So it continues at a brisk pace, really across laboratory segments. Let's take a look now at mega mergers. So this is a fairly recent trend where you're starting to see mergers and acquisitions across elements of the healthcare workflow. So we've got a number of examples listed on this slide. I'll call out one, CVS and Aetna, where you've got a financial payer partnering up with one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the United States. That dynamic and how those changes are going to flow through and eventually affect clinical laboratories is still a question that I think is under some discussion. But it should be interesting to look at the impact of these changes as they begin to take shape and as we start to see these companies look for synergies through these deals. So macro forces are pushing the industry toward further consolidation. These are all working toward driving down prices in an environment of reduced reimbursement. And again, we just talked about that a little while ago. Larger organizations do tend to want to streamline their relationships, so that does make it harder for small labs that maybe offer a small menu of testing to get airtime with payers and even providers. And then there's also the scale that comes with a large purchase base. So that again changes the economics for larger entities relative to smaller entities. There are laboratories that could theoretically get swept up in some of these mega merger transactions. So for example, Sonic Healthcare and BioReference, 2 of the larger independent clinical labs, could be acquisition targets within the next couple of years. Even some of the largest clinical laboratories like LabCorp and Quest could be potential acquisition targets for maybe companies outside of the traditional clinical lab space. Just as we saw Aetna acquire CVS, there could be a company out there that ends up pursuing Quest and or LabCorp at some point. So the last point we'll make on this slide is that when you look at valuations of labs, the changing dynamic over the last several years suggests that valuations for some labs may be a bit high right now, and that could be a further headwind for more consolidation. We asked our panel, given the changing economics of labs, what are you planning to do about it? You can see over half of the panel said we're not planning any changes, but 23% of laboratories are planning some type of consolidation, sale, or closure as a result of what they're seeing in the industry. Finally, we asked them, do you expect any impact from these recently announced mega merger transactions that we talked about a little bit before? 41% of them said they don't. But you can see 29% said either they expect reduced reimbursement or reduced volume as a result of these transactions. Interestingly, another, 19% said that they actually they actually expect increased reimbursement, increased volume, or faster reimbursement as a result of these transactions. So it'll be really interesting maybe a year from now, once some of these transactions have a chance to work their way through the system, to take a look at the impact that we're seeing from them. Finally, we'll talk about external shocks. So CMS has been very busy over the last several years. You have the first national coverage decision for NGS testing, looking at cancer patients, specifically for targeted therapy. You also have the first ADLT designation going into effect through the PAMA law. Foundation Medicine in May of 2018 was the first company to receive that ADLT designation. On the FDA side, with the change in administration, there's been a lot of movement recently where you see the first approval of direct-to-consumer testing. We'll talk about that in just a second. The first accreditation of a third-party reviewer, so the New York State Department of Health, which has been part of the CLIA program and is widely recognized as the most stringent of the CLIA participating states, is now approved as a third-party reviewer for the FDA. And then finally, you have a new framework for reporting biomarkers in tumor profiling next-generation sequencing tests. So a lot of firsts happening here. The ground is still moving underneath the feet of clinical laboratories, and the impacts of these changes, I think, will be very interesting to study over the next couple of years. Let's talk about direct-to-consumer testing. So a lot of companies out there offering different types of direct-to-consumer testing. We've got 23andMe focusing on germline cancer and hereditary genotyping. We've got Helix focusing on ancestry panels using next-generation sequencing. We've got companies like Veritas focusing on whole genome sequencing by next-generation sequencing. So a lot of different practice types. Order methods tend to vary. There are some that are strictly online, there are some that are patient or online or practice, like Color, for example. You can see that these companies have raised a tremendous amount of capital, between the $491 million from 23andMe. I believe that does not include the recent investment from the pharmaceutical industry into 23andMe. We've got $320 million from Helix, so a lot of money going into this space. The thing that is beginning to become a fault line between these companies is the need for a physician sign-off. So you can see here, just among these four companies, we've got two that do not require a physician sign-off and two that require a physician sign-off. So how exactly we're drawing that line is probably going to be a point of contention here over the next several years. And we do see physicians having some concerns around patients going directly to these companies and then getting their results without ever really interacting with a physician to discuss the implications of these tests. We asked our panel of these recent FDA approvals, including 23andMe, but also beyond, do you feel that these are good for patient care? You can see that most respondents said that they do feel that they are good for patient care. Of the ones that said that they disagreed, you can see that we've got a quote here in the lower left-hand side. Direct-to-consumer tests can be dangerous, especially if the results are interpreted by the patient and not a specialized provider. So again, that's focusing more on the direct-to-consumer testing as opposed to some of the other diagnostic tests that fall into that bucket. On the right-hand side, we asked about ADLTs. You can see that most respondents were either in favor of ADLTs or they were neutral. I think providers do realize, and especially clinical lab professionals realize the value that the ADLT designation could potentially have for bringing new technology to the market. But exactly in the fashion in which that works is still to be examined. That concludes our webinar today. Thank you so much for your time. If you'd like to learn more about our survey, you can contact Greg Thompson, Lauren, Christina, or myself to find out more, and also find out more about how we can develop custom surveys to answer specific questions to help your business. Have a great day.